Good afternoon and welcome to AIADA's AutoTalk. I'm your host, Rachel Soleimani. Before we get started, a few quick reminders. Anyone who is registered for today's program will be receiving a copy by early next week. And if you have any questions, be sure to enter them into the Q&A bar at the lower right-hand side of your interface. Today we welcome Daniel Garces, Senior Vice President and Director of Acquisitions at Capital Automotive, one of our newer affinity partners here at AIADA. Dan, I know you have a lot to get to today, so I'm going to let you take it away.
Well, thanks, Rachel, for that introduction, and thanks to AIADA for the opportunity to share some insights that we've gained from our experience in underwriting dealership real estate over the years. So today, we're going to discuss the major components you should consider when purchasing dealership real estate. And this includes how do you value a property, or what are the different phases of an environmental site assessment? How detailed is a property condition assessment, and what do they actually look at? And finally, why title, survey, and zoning are so important. So you might ask, where did we get all this knowledge? Well, we're celebrating 25 years in business. We're really proud of that. And we've underwritten over $6 billion of automotive retail properties all over the US and Canada. So we've seen almost everything you can imagine on dealership properties. And when I say everything, I mean it, including we saw a property that was built over a former cattle slaughterhouse. There were decomposing cow carcasses that were causing a sinkhole on the property. So that's pretty unique and something you don't hear often. Okay, well, now that I got everybody's attention, let's get started. So another affinity partner for AIADA, Kerrigan Advisors, they recently issued their Blue Sky report. And in it, they cited record blue sky activity. Over 844 franchises traded hands in the last 12-month period. Now, this is relevant to today's presentation because they also stated that the average dealership real estate value ranged somewhere between $11 and $16.5 million. That's per property, not per transaction. So in a lot of these cases, we're seeing the real estate values are close to or even sometimes above the blue sky values, which makes underwriting real estate as important as underwriting the business. Now, the outlook for 2023 is still positive. There are certainly some headwinds that we're facing. We're seeing increases in interest rate environment, and that's increasing people's cost of capital. There's uncertainty regarding facility requirements, certainly with EV upgrades and other image upgrades from the manufacturers. And we're still dealing with some legacy supply chain issues, and people are trying to adjust their business to meet e-commerce trends. So this does impact the need for land and facilities. So what do you consider when you're buying a dealership? Obviously, you have to underwrite two major components. You need to look at the operations and the real estate because they're both big investments. From the operations side, dealers are generally very knowledgeable and savvy about what they are looking for when they're looking at new acquisitions. They understand the financial performance of the specific stores. They need to understand the financial controls and the policies. They might even perform a quality of earnings on the historical operations of the dealer that they're buying. Oftentimes, dealers are building their own projections. They're based on their own cost structure and how they think they can hit some operating efficiencies based on their expertise. Dealers really do underwrite their manufacturers that they're buying franchises from and the franchise strength of those brands that are in that manufacturer. They're looking at current franchise strength and where the future of that franchise is going. Dealers spend a lot of time understanding the personnel of an operation. They also consider including or understanding the existing leadership of the store that they're buying, or will they need to replace that leadership? There's a lot of information you have to get into to understand the competition, the market demographics. Even the prior dealer's reputation could impact what you would value a property at or a dealership at. There's a lot of things that a dealer is looking at from an operational perspective, but do they have that same expertise on the real estate? Are you paying the right price for the property? Is it a clean property? Has it been properly maintained over the last several years? Are there any restrictions on the property or the use of the property? Do other people have easements or rights to use the property as well? Is your zoning conditional? Could you lose the ability to sell new vehicles on the property? These are just some of the questions you have to ask, and these can be answered by all the real estate due diligence that you go through. Now you multiply these questions by the number of stores you're acquiring, and the information that you have to review could be daunting. So how do you do this? Well, you either have a staff in your corporate office that specializes in analyzing all these variables, like some of the public dealers or the large private dealer groups, or you need to hire professionals to assist you in underwriting, whether it's your attorneys, your CPAs, or other professionals to help you get through all this diligence. So let's talk about the third-party reports that you typically need to order. They're listed at the top of this page. In any acquisition, you're going to want to order almost all of these reports, with the exception of seismic, which is really only necessary in certain locations, and an EV site assessment, which is new, but also might become more common. Just to briefly explain what an EV site assessment is, it's something you can add on to your property condition assessment report, and what the engineer is going to look for is that property currently set up and have enough capacity to handle the charging stations that you'll need to install on the property if you have to put high-speed chargers on the property? Do you have enough power supply to the property today, or do you need to invest in more transformers and upgrade your power delivery to the location? This is a new report. We haven't seen too many of these, but it is actually something that's quite interesting to look at. So the next thing you got to consider is how long it takes to get through all this diligence. We estimate it takes typically 45 to 60 days to get through that diligence. And it could cost approximately $25,000 per property. Now this can change depending on the acres, the number of buildings, or the size of the buildings, and all that can affect. You can also get economies of scale. If there's contiguous properties, you might not be spending 25 per property. You can also expedite the time it takes to get through this diligence, sometimes by a few weeks with your vendor. Now you'll pay an extra fee to get an expedited report, but you could compress the time frame it takes to get through the diligence. Some things to be aware of as you're going through the buy-sell. It can take weeks to negotiate your real estate purchase agreement and your asset purchase agreement. While the attorneys are going back and forth, you should really consider getting your proposals ready from your vendors so that the day you sign that purchase agreement, you can engage the reports and not lose any time on your due diligence period in that agreement. This is really important because sellers typically don't want to give you an extension for due diligence without getting something in return. So if you want to avoid that, you can engage your reports right away and hopefully avoid having to renegotiate your APA for an extension in your diligence time. Also, as a buyer, you should be sure to ask the seller to share their historical reports. As a seller, you should be willing to share those reports because it should make the transaction smoother. Full transparency really does help avoid surprises. And one caveat I would give as a buyer is generally you shouldn't solely rely on the seller's reports. It is a best practice to engage your own due diligence. However, starting with the historical reports can save you time and money as you complete your diligence. So let's talk about real estate valuation. You get valuation on a property for many different reasons. Maybe you're trying to determine what the insurable value should be, or you're contesting your real estate taxes. You might want to determine the value for estate planning needs, or you just need the value for your lender to get a mortgage on the property. Now, often in a buy-sell, one of the biggest questions that centers around what valuation is, not just of the business, but of the real estate as well. So why do we get an assessment of valuation in a buy-sell? Well, it's really simply to guide the buyer and the seller to agree to a fair price. Both parties need to be aware of what type of valuation was performed because this can influence that final number. So on the bottom half of the slide, I have the two types of valuation you can get. You can get a broker's opinion of value or an appraisal. Now, a broker's opinion of value is simply what the name sounds like. You work with a local broker and you get an opinion of the value of the real estate. They know the market very clearly in that area, and they give you, based on comps and what they think they could sell the property for, a number. That number could vary greatly depending on the broker you use and how aggressive they may be. Most banks, actually all banks, do not allow or lend against a broker's opinion of value. They're looking for a more scientific approach, which is an appraisal. Appraisals generally are meeting the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP standards, and they use MAI certified appraisers to derive their conclusion of values. Now, there are two types of appraisals you can get. You can get a fee simple appraisal or a least fee appraisal. On a fee simple appraisal, it values the property at the highest and best use with no real other encumbrances on the property. But a lease fee value values the property with financial instrument in place, which is a lease. And this approach primarily puts value on the income stream generated from the lease and focuses less on the unencumbered highest and best use of the property. This can sometimes be higher than the fee simple value and sometimes lower. It does depend on the terms of the lease, if the rent is at market, and how much remaining term is left on that lease. If there's short remaining term on the lease, it might have a lower value, and if it's a longer term in the remaining lease, it might have a higher value. But for purposes of a buy-sell, you should really focus on the fee simple valuation of a property, not the lease fee valuation. So let me describe what a fee simple appraisal really does. You can see the three approaches identified on this page. And as I said on the previous slide, there are certain standards the appraiser must follow in arriving to their conclusion. The appraiser considers three different approaches to the valuation. Typically, they put more weight on the cost approach and the sales comparison approach, but they do consider the income approach as well. In determining the cost approach, the appraiser considers the building size, the site improvements, and then they apply a depreciation factor based on the economic remaining life of the facilities. This can be subjective. So it's really important to understand the assumptions that the appraiser made, because it can skew the value. If you're reviewing an appraisal, go to the cost page and check the numbers. Make sure that the acreage and the building square feet are correct, and that you agree with, or at least understand, the depreciation assumptions that the appraiser used. If you have questions, talk to the appraiser. They should be able to explain their assumptions and defend their conclusion. The same is true in the sales comparison approach. The appraiser looks at market comps, and they can adjust those comps up or down to make it more comparable to the subject property. But this too is subjective, so be sure to review them and understand them. Bottom line, don't just accept an appraisal on its surface. Make sure that you or some other professionals have reviewed and understand the assumptions that the appraisers are making. Moving on to environmental. So most people have heard of a phase 1 or a phase 2. These are the two types of reports that you can get on a property from an environmental perspective. A phase 1 is really simply a visual inspection of the property and the features that might pose a risk from an environmental perspective. There's no drilling that happens in a phase 1. The environmental engineer will walk through the property, they'll check for the features and see what they think is a risk. They'll review historical data. They might look at federal and state levels to get data on maintenance records or existing underground storage tanks, above ground storage tanks. They may ask the dealer for information on their maintenance records for oil water separators or hydraulic lifts or septic systems. Based on what they're seeing and what they observe, they may recommend a phase 2 for a variety of reasons, including standing on a property or the age of the equipment, if there were any reported off-site leaks that might have migrated onto the property, or based on lack of maintenance or clear records, they may ask for a phase 2. If you do go to a phase 2, this could delay a little bit of time on your buy-sell. It's going to require time to order a new phase 2 to delineate the area that you think is at risk and to get the borings on the drillers on the property to do the borings. Now, regarding the delineation of the area at risk, it's important that you review that and you understand where they're going to drill. Sometimes they may be more aggressive than they need to be in where they think they should be drilling. So if you can determine where you think the areas of risk are, and you see that they have a boring on the other side of the property, you could ask, why are you going to drill over here when I thought the area of risk was on the east side of the property? So what are they drilling for? Well, they drill for soil and water samples, and then they send them to a lab for comparison to maximum acceptable limits. If no exceedance is detected, then there's likely no other action that is necessary. You got a clean phase 2, you can move on and close on your acquisition. But if there is an exceedance detected, then this could trigger reporting to state and federal agencies. It could also require a remediation plan or an action plan. If you get to that phase and there is an exceedance, you may be required to remove or replace certain property features, whether it's an oil water separator that was cracked or leaking, or a former underground storage tank that is still there. You may need to remove contaminated soil. You may need to install some monitoring wells, and then those are tested regularly over time. They may put an environmental land use restriction on your property, and this could be recorded on title. This may limit the way you can use your building or your facility in the future. We oftentimes hear of people getting a no further action letter, which is great, but don't be fooled. A no further action letter is simply no further action. It doesn't mean the property is clean. There could still be contamination on the property. However, it's not to a point that is of any risk to, life or safety. So the environmental agency might say, we'll just keep an eye on it and let it sit and not do anything. But if you ever decide to redevelop the property or do construction or change the configuration of the property, you may violate your NFA or be required to do more testing or cleanup at that time. So just be aware that an NFA does come with restrictions, and you need to understand what those are. So with all that risk and doom and gloom with environmental, people say, well, why do we even get environmental reports? It just opens up a can of worms. Well, the truth is, you want to get an environmental report to set up a baseline, especially if you're in the middle of a buy-sell. As the seller, you want to know or be able to say that, hey, when I turned this property over, we did a phase 1, and there was no major risks or concerns related to environmental. And so if something happens in the future, you're not liable as the seller because you have a baseline that showed that there was no issue then. As a buyer, you want to make sure that what you're buying is clean and that you're not inheriting some problems that were caused by the previous owner. So establishing a baseline is really important. And environmental issues do have impact on valuation. It could increase ongoing expenses of operating a store or a property. An environmental land use restriction could result in your inability to redevelop the property in a way that might be better for you in the future. If you have monitoring wells, you may have business interruption for ongoing remediation or testing of those wells. There may be costs associated to collecting the data on the wells and reporting it to the agency. So you need to be aware if there are any other restrictions on a property, because that could cause costs for you as the operator. Now, a best practice for sellers and operators is really to keep good records and adhere to maintenance schedules for your oil water separators, your lifts, your septic systems, maintaining annual inspections as might be required. This really does help in getting a phase 1 to potentially not require a phase 2. If the environmental engineer is satisfied with your maintenance records and you can demonstrate that you've been diligent in keeping your facilities up to snuff, they might not require a phase 2, and you can move on to your buy-sell. Moving on to property condition assessment. Similar to an environmental report, property condition assessment has an engineer walk through the property and do a visual inspection. They're assessing the structure of the roof, the mechanical, the electrical components of the building. They're checking parking, asphalt, pavement, drainage on the facility or on the property. What they're trying to do is identify if there's anything that is, from a deferred maintenance perspective, going to cost the new operator money to repair. They're also identifying ADA or OSHA and other life safety compliance issues. They provide estimated costs and timelines to repair the deferred maintenance. And this could include immediate needs or things that could happen or might need to be repaired in 3 years or 5 years down the road. The impacts to valuation from a property condition assessment could be material as well. Deferred maintenance can result in a discount on the purchase price of the property. Non-compliance with OSHA or ADA requirements could result in significant penalties and fees, so you need to be aware of those and repair them as quickly as possible. Similar to environmental, a best practice would be adhere to maintenance schedules for all your systems and keep good records. Periodically review your ADA compliance and your OSHA and life safety requirements to make sure you're in compliance with them. And address roof leaks, flooding, or ponding on the lot, or any kind of pavement issues immediately. Fixing a small leak today will be a lot less expensive than the damage that could be caused from a long-term problem that's been ignored. If you're buying a property in any of the locations on this map that are in orange or yellow, it might be a best practice to complete a seismic analysis as part of your property condition assessment. Now, there's not much more to discuss here regarding seismic issues, but we would be remiss if we didn't identify that this is a risk, depending on where your property is located, and let you know that there are resources to underwrite it and make sure that you're prepared or you understand it. So one of the last set of items that you're going to look at from a due diligence perspective, and certainly not the least important, is title, survey, and zoning. These are usually very related, and this is where you're going to likely rely mostly on your attorneys to ensure that you're protected and that you're aware of any restrictions or obligations that come with a property. Title, survey, and zoning are all very interrelated. On title, what it does is it discloses who's the ownership of the property and what rights they have to use the land. There may be public land record searches that'll reveal if there are restrictions on a property or an obligation that runs with the land. Now, a survey gives you a visual depiction of the property. It gives you the boundary lines of the property based on the legal description. And it provides locations of where the buildings are. It allows you to see if the footprint is over any setbacks or easements on the property. Makes sure that you have the proper number of parking spaces on a property. So a survey is a very important piece of the title review because they both go together, as is the zoning. So let me give some examples of common title issues. They would include a covenant, conditions, and restrictions on a property, which could be related to an auto mall or common areas on a property. There could be liens on properties. There could be manufacturer site control that shows up on title. There could be easements that show up on title. You got to go through all of these documents and make sure that you understand what these easements or these liens are on the property. These kind of restrictions can and usually do negatively impact the value of a property. So you should look to see if the restrictions have an expiration date or if there are conditions that can be met to remove them. You should obtain estoppels from the associations if you're in a common area, like an auto mall, to ensure that previous monetary or performance obligations have been met and conditions will not change for you in the future based on the CC&Rs. We saw a property once where there was an estoppel stating that common ownership fees and maintenance would never change. But within a few months of closing, the association sent a letter saying that the fees were going to triple. So we produced the estoppel document, which the association actually executed prior to closing, and it ended up that they really could not increase those fees. But they certainly attempted to triple the fees that were the responsibility of the property owner. We were able to stop that by getting a proper estoppel in place before closing. From a zoning perspective, it's really important to know if the property has a conditional use permit or if its current allowable use is permanent. You don't want to lose zoning because you didn't meet a specific condition. And if that's a risk, you'll need to know what those conditions are and how you have to stay on top of them. We saw a property once that lost zoning as a body shop because the operator failed to submit a recertification and pay a small fee in a timely manner. The municipality was under political pressure to redevelop the area, and they refused to reinstate the zoning under any circumstance because they no longer wanted a body shop there. So just missing a simple date or a small fee could lose complete zoning and use of the property. So you need to make sure you understand that. There's also go dark provisions in some properties from a zoning perspective. And if a property has a go dark provision and it doesn't have continuous operations, that could lead to a loss of zoning. For example, if a property was dark for more than 3 months, you may need to reapply for zoning if you want to use it for the exact same use you were using it before it went dark. This is why it's so important to understand these conditions up front and to stay on top of them throughout your ownership. In summary, real estate is a material part of a buy-sell, and I hope today you learned some key components to be aware of when you're ordering, reviewing reports from third-party vendors. Remember to give yourself ample time to complete the diligence you need in your real estate purchase agreement. If you're a seller, share clear maintenance records and historical reports to reduce surprises. If you're a buyer, use vendors that have experience in automotive retail properties. Underwriting real estate can be a lot of fun, and you're certainly going to run into things that you never expected as you're doing it. But you can be really creative in structuring a deal around the challenges you face. Real estate issues should never be an impediment to closing a good deal. If you have a willing buyer and a seller at the table, that deal will close. Rachel, again, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a really great presentation, and I loved how you touched on a lot of points that people don't normally think of. So just thank you again. To those on the line, you'll be receiving a copy of this webinar by early next week, and you will also get the slide deck with it as well. For more information about AIADA, visit aiada.org. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great day, everyone.